Hello, everyone. So, this week's video lecture is about the causes of the Second World War. We'll be talking about the sort of rise of fascism and authoritarianism around the world in the 1930s and the factors that led the United States to become involved in the Second World War. So, that's our topic for this week. So, to start off our discussion of this topic, we have to look at what is going on with American foreign policy during the 1920s and 1930s. And foreign policy isn't really what most people think about when they think about the 1920s and 1930s. And that has sort of resulted in the general impression that the United States, after having spent several decades pursuing a pretty expansionist foreign policy and intervention in foreign affairs, in the 1920s, we kind of retreat back into domestic matters. This is sometimes cited as one of the reasons for the breakdown of the peaceful world order in the 1930s. Some argue that if the United States had maintained a more vigilant attitude toward foreign affairs, the peace may not have collapsed. There were a substantial number of Americans who made isolationist arguments in the aftermath of the First World War. There was a general feeling that the country had kind of been burned by our involvement in the European War. All of the faults and flaws of the Versailles Treaty, the League of Nations, we don't end up joining this organization that President Wilson sort of started. We kind of saw some of the European powers as being a little ungrateful for our help, that they were continuing to kind of squabble amongst themselves, and that it was better to just sort of let them be and not get involved in their kind of arguments. The US government doesn't really seem to be pursuing much of a aggressive foreign policy agenda throughout the most of the 1920s. The US, as I said, had rejected getting involved in the League of Nations. Many politicians were pretty adamant at this time that the US should never again get involved in a foreign war. And the government during most of the 1920s seemed to be more interested in pursuing the strength and promoting the health of the domestic economy. The United States, along with other countries around the world, pursued disarmament after the First World War, and there was a lot of confidence that having our economic superiority combined with the natural barriers that were provided by the Atlantic and the Pacific Ocean, that would protect America. Then in the 1930s, when the Great Depression hits, uh, Roosevelt and the American public really don't put a lot of emphasis on foreign involvement, and there's a lot of bigger problems at home that need to be solved. And so stabilizing the American economy and the society at home seems to be more important than playing a big role in international affairs. But world events in the 1930s are going to increasingly draw the United States back into the international arena. And we can see that in this cartoon here. We have Uncle Sam standing, excuse me, on the shores of the United States, looking across to these storm clouds that are gathering over Europe and looming kind of menacingly over there. And the Atlantic Ocean, he's sort of lamenting, really ain't what it used to be. So it's growing increasingly clear to many in the 1930s that there are some sort of really disturbing signs on the horizon. A lot of that has to do with the rise of what became known as fascism in Europe and in other countries around the world. And so I want to spend a little bit of time talking about what fascism is. The term gets thrown around a lot these days, as there has been a kind of rise, a new rise in authoritarianism throughout the world. So I thought it would be instructive to define what fascism means, because this is really what the United States was fighting against in World War II. Fascism is a mass political movement that emphasizes extreme nationalism, militarism, and the supremacy of the nation over the individual. And this particular model of government stands in contrast to liberal democracies that promote individual rights and competitive elections and political dissent. In a lot of ways, fascist regimes begin as revolutions. They advocate for the overthrow of existing systems of government and the persecution of their political enemies. But these regimes are also highly conservative in the championing of traditional values. So it's almost like a conservative revolution or a revolution from the right wing of the political spectrum. Although fascist leaders typically claim that they support the everyman, in reality, their regimes often align with powerful business and economic interests. So, fascism emphasizes the following: extreme nationalism. Fascist leaders believe in the supremacy of certain groups of people based on characteristics like race or religion or ethnicity or nationality. They cultivate what's known as a cult of personality. They cultivate images of their leaders as great figures to be loved and admired. And this is often perpetuated through the mass media and through propaganda. And they emphasize popular mobilization. Both authoritarian and fascist governments are anti-democratic. They don't leave a lot of room for dissent. They strive to centralize power. But authoritarian and fascist are not the same thing. Authoritarian governments want their populations to remain passive and demobilized. Fascist regimes, on the other hand, try to energize public participation in society through government organized, government sponsored channels. And they try to create the sense that the individual is subsumed, is just a tiny part of the state. The state is everything, and individuals are nothing. They are just a small part of the state. One scholar of fascism has identified 5 stages that nations go through when fascist parties emerge and come into power. This is a man named Robert Paxton, and he has sort of explained that fascists emerge out of disillusionment. Both Mussolini and Hitler rose to prominence in the aftermath of the First World War. They capitalized on the political and economic fallout of the war by inflaming popular dissatisfaction with Italy and Germany's leaders. And the economic crisis that followed the First World War further eroded public confidence in the existing political establishment. Next, what they do is they establish legitimacy. Fascist leaders were able to capitalize on this popular disillusionment and sort to kind of be the source of their political power. Mussolini and Hitler created their own political parties to challenge the ruling establishment through the ballot box, through elections, and also often violence in the streets. So in 1919, Mussolini created Italy's fascist party, which was very openly pro-Italian nationalism and anti-socialist. They attacked, the group organized these armed militias known as the squadristi or the black shirts, which described what the kind of uniform that they wore. And they attracted these very fervent followers. These fascist militants often fought with Italian socialists in the streets of major Italian cities. Similarly, Germany's Nazi Party, originally founded as the National Socialist German Workers' Party, they also emerged in the aftermath of the war. In 1920, many Germans were kind of shocked by their defeat in the First World War. And so the Nazis pushed this narrative that argued that Germany could have won the war if not for division and unrest at home. This myth largely falsely accused Jewish people in Germany and left-wing activists of undermining the country's war effort. There was, as it was known, the stab in the back theory that said that the country had been stabbed in the back by these traitorous elements. Uh, the Nazis also blamed Germany's new democratic government for abandoning the conflict and for accepting the harsh peace terms from the Allied powers. And so, propelled by this vision of revenge and bitterness, they went from winning about 3% of the vote in the 1928 parliamentary elections to 44% by 1933. They were also supported by their own paramilitary group known as the Sturmballottung, or the Brown Shirts. This militant army, like the Squadristi, clashed with communists in German cities and other rivals of the Nazi Party. They are able to gain power by cultivating partnerships with conservative groups. So, interwar Europe in the period of the 1920s and into the 1930s, featured primarily two political groups. There were conservatives and there were socialists. So, things had become, the politics had become fairly polarized. A third option, fascists, they were gaining power by partnering with the conservatives. Conservatives advocated for traditional values, including nationalism and law and order. And conservatives recognized that fascists wanted to overthrow the political establishment, which seems to be kind of antithetical to what conservatives would want, right? Conservatives is all about conserving. It's all about maintaining the status quo. But the two groups kind of found common cause over their shared fear and hatred of socialism. Communist regimes were gaining power and influence across Europe after they first came into power in Russia in 1917, and they were seen as an existential threat to conservative values. In Italy, conservatives combined forces with Mussolini's fascist party to form a governing majority in parliament following elections that were held in 1921. Meanwhile, in Germany, the country's conservative leaders allied with the Nazis. This was a big mistake on the part of the conservative powers. Both conservative parties in Italy and in Germany believed that a fascist coalition would be a short-term compromise to prevent the socialists from taking power, and they believed that they would be able to control the fascist elements. This turned out to be a big miscalculation. Upon rising to power, fascist parties attempted to consolidate their political authority. Mussolini's fascist party won elections in 1921 as part of this coalition with the conservatives. The following year, the Italian king appointed Mussolini as prime minister after a massive fascist demonstration known as the March on Rome. As the fascist party started to gain more and more power, many Italians were afraid that there would be civil war if Mussolini were denied rising to kind of ultimate power. The fascists, however, in Italy, they didn't seize absolute authority. Traditional institutions like the Catholic Church still retained a certain degree of independence in Italy. The Nazis, on the other hand, they consolidated power absolutely. They took total control over the government and society. Hitler removed all non-Nazis from government shortly after becoming chancellor in 1933. He goes on to pass laws stripping Jewish Germans of citizenship, expelling anti-Nazi professors from universities. To further consolidate his control, Hitler banned rival political parties and enabled himself to rule by decree, basically meaning that he could single-handedly and without any kind of oversight create future laws for Germany. So Germany becomes a one-party country. The Nazis claim to have won more than 90% of the vote in elections that were held in November of 1933. These were definitely not free and fair elections. And after 1938, Germany ceases holding elections altogether. So they really end up consolidating this power. And the final, or almost the sort of last stage, is implementing these really radical reforms. Having near total or absolute control over society, fascist leaders began to exercise their power in increasingly radical ways. Mussolini in Italy carried out violent colonial campaigns across Africa. In Libya, colonial Italian troops used chemical weapons against local resistance movements there. They imprisoned their members in concentration camps. In 1935, as we're going to see, Italy invaded what is now known as the country of Ethiopia, where virulent racism led to mass horrific instances of war crimes, rapes, the indiscriminate killing of hundreds of thousands of people. Mussolini's regime did not carry out the same kind of ethnic violence at home, but his government did proclaim white Christian Italians to be superior and banned people of color or Jewish people in Italy from marrying them. Hitler's Nazi Germany remains the only example of full radicalization of a fascist movement. As Germany's absolute ruler, or Führer, Hitler gets rid of all political opposition. He orders the genocide of millions. He invades countries across Europe, and in partnership with Mussolini, launches World War II, the deadliest conflict in human history. Even 75 years after Hitler's death, his rise to power and Germany's fall from democracy into fascism is a really frightening reminder. What happens if racism and extremism are left to fester in politics? So that's a little bit about what is happening here, kind of broadly examples of what is happening. Now I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the events that directly lead us into the Second World War. And we're going to start actually not in Europe, but in Japan. After Japan and Russia fight a war in 1904, 1905, Japan is largely viewed as kind of the major winner of that conflict, and Japan becomes kind of the dominant power in Northeast Asia. Afterwards, and especially after World War I, Japan was viewed as a respected world power. Japan makes a number of treaties with the United States in 1922 and 1921 and 1922. They sign a disarmament treaty. They also sign a 9-power treaty pledging to respect Chinese independence and territorial integrity. But Japan's commitment to the post-World War I international order that had been set up begins to encounter widespread domestic opposition, especially after Japan signs another disarmament treaty later in the 1920s. And this is particularly true in the Japanese military. There are elements within the Japanese military who are very expansionist, who want Japan to become a major colonizing power, and believe that Japan really should be the dominant power throughout all of Asia. These military officials accuse the civilian government of Japan of violating the Japanese emperor's right of supreme command. And in particular, the Japanese military authority that is sort of operating in China is kind of relatively independent, and they are more inclined toward taking a very hard line with China than the Japanese civilian government was. China at this point is also kind of mired in internal troubles, and they seem to be kind of inclined to appease the Japanese. So the Japanese military in the area known as Manchuria, they wanted to provoke an incident with the Chinese that would allow them to invade and set up a puppet government here. They manufacture this incident by blowing up a section of railroad, and they blame it on the Chinese military forces nearby. The Japanese use this as an excuse to attack the Chinese. They meet with very little resistance. This sort of conflict, this manufactured false flag type conflict, ends with an almost complete Japanese victory. The Japanese invade Manchuria. They rename the country Manchukuo. They establish a puppet regime there. So Japan is starting to expand its territory. The Chinese appealed to the League of Nations in 1931 for help, and the League of Nations said, we urge you guys to stop fighting. They came to the United States, even though the U.S. is not part of the League of Nations, and said, sort of, can you help negotiate a settlement between Japan and China? The United States believed that the Japanese army could be checked by the civilian leaders of Japan, but they really overestimated the government's ability to control the Japanese military. When the League of Nations calls for a ceasefire, the military refuses. They escalate things, in fact. And when the League of Nations eventually investigates and blames the Chinese for having manufactured this crisis in Manchuria, Japan decides it's going to withdraw from the League of Nations. So this is kind of the first sign that things are not okay in the international situation. The next kind of troubling area of expansion comes when Italy invades Ethiopia in 1935. As I mentioned, Mussolini, the Italian fascist dictator, he wants to restore the Italian empire over the Mediterranean. The Italians were a little bit envious of some of the other European colonial powers. They didn't really have many colonies of their own, and they felt they kind of got the short end of the stick after World War I. Ethiopia was one of the few African countries that wasn't actually currently a colony, and attacking and invading Ethiopia would help to unify some of the areas that Italy already held in Africa, the sort of small nation of Eritrea up here, and the Italian Somaliland down here, along the Horn of Africa here. And Ethiopia was considered to be militarily pretty weak, and it had a lot of resources that the Italians wanted. The Ethiopians had previously successfully fought with the Italians all the way back in 1896, and they fought for their independence. They were forced to recognize the independence of Ethiopia. So Italy is kind of targeting Ethiopia as a possibility for creating more of a colony. So the Italians begin to build up troops along the border between Ethiopia and Somaliland in 1930. They establish an outpost here in an area known as Walwal, which was within European territory. Or Ethiopian territory. The Ethiopians protest these incursions, and the League of Nations attempts to kind of keep the peace here and appease the Italians and the Ethiopians. But on October 3rd, 1935, the Italians attacked. They attacked from the north in Eritrea, and they attacked from the south in Somaliland. The League of Nations imposes an embargo on Italy, but this is largely ineffective because it doesn't cover vital things like oil. And Italy finally basically annexes Ethiopia on May 7th, 1936. The following month, In June 1936, the Emperor of Ethiopia, who is now in exile, Haile Selassie, he gives a speech before the League of Nations denouncing Italy's actions and criticizing the world community for just standing by and watching. As a result of the League's condemnation of Italy, Mussolini declares that the country is going to withdraw from the League of Nations. So now we have two nations who have withdrawn their support and participation in the League of Nations. And it's actually three because Germany had also withdrawn from the League when Hitler comes to power in 1933. So these are very troubling signs. Next, there's trouble going on in Spain. The Spanish are fighting a civil war really from 1935 to 1939 after a lot of political unrest and fighting between the conservative nationalists and the leftist Republican factions in Spain. The Civil War breaks out in earnest in 1936 when exiled conservative military leaders, including General Francisco Franco, who you can see up here on the right, staged rebellions in Spanish territories. This uprising pretty soon spreads to Spain itself. Different factions are seizing control of different parts of the country. When the leader of the rebellion, General Jose Sanjurjo, dies in a plane crash, Franco assumes command. And on October 1st, 1936, he is publicly proclaimed as the Generalissimo of the fascist army and Jefe del Estado, or head of state. Franco's fascist nationalists were supported with troops and weapons and aircraft by both Hitler and Mussolini. The Soviet Union, on the other hand, they're in support of the opposition, the Republicans, because they are on the left. They are sort of more leaning towards socialism. And people from lots of different countries come to Spain to fight on the side of the Republicans who are trying to oppose the fascists. 40,000 men and women fought in what were known as the International Brigades, including many Americans. The Americans sent a brigade they called the Abraham Lincoln Brigade. And Spain, fighting against the fascists in Spain, becomes a pretty sort of celebrated cause for a lot of left-leaning intellectuals across the Western world, and many prominent artists and writers were on the side of the Republicans. It attracted also a lot of left-wing working class men for whom the war offered something to do, while they were unemployed because of the Depression, but also kind of it appealed to their ideals. Some of the more famous Americans and British men participating on the side of the Republicans were writers like Ernest Hemingway and George Orwell. By early 1939, the Spanish Civil War was over, and Franco assumes dictatorial power. After the end of the war, he enacts pretty harsh reprisals against his enemies on the left. Thousands of Republicans are imprisoned. Between 10,000 to 28,000 of them are executed. And it's been estimated that Franco's regime ultimately ends up killing around 200,000 of its political opponents. So we now have a number of nations in Europe who have fallen to some sort of fascism. And even though Japan is not really fascist, the Japanese military is gaining increasing political power throughout the 1930s as well. And we see this manifest itself in 1937 with the beginning of what becomes known as the Second Sino-Japanese War. Since the Japanese invasion of Manchuria in 1931, the Chinese and Japanese had been fighting kind of intermittently. But all-out war begins in 1937. On July 7th, 1937, the Japanese invade the northern Chinese city of Beiping. They begin to move southward. They quickly occupy Shanghai and Nanjing. The picture... These pictures are from what happened in Shanghai and Nanjing, and multiple atrocities were committed in the Japanese sort of invasions. It was, sort of widely reported throughout Western media. And most Western countries, although the Japanese still dispute this, but most Western countries estimate that civilian deaths from the seizure of Nanking or Nanjing were around 300,000, including many women and children. Lots of atrocities being committed, war crimes, mutilations, rapes, all kinds of, sort of terrible atrocities committed. And this continues to be a point of contention between China and Japan. The Japanese were still kind of divided over whether they should kind of go back to a sort of less, kind of expansionist foreign policy, or whether they should push for having kind of what they called a new order in East Asia. And so basically, eventually, the Japanese government decides that they're going to sort of pursue this new order, that they were going to formally reject this system of international order that had been set up in the 1920s. And this is seen by the United States as kind of really a point of no return. The idea that now, there's no reconciliation, that it's going to be possible without the Japanese just repudiating this kind of overt, aggressive militarism. So it's at this point that the U.S. begins to consider applying economic pressure on Japan. Probably the most disturbing developments of all is what's happening in Germany. So I'm going to go back a little bit and talk about how Hitler comes to power in Germany and what that begins to look like. So after World War I, a democratic government was established in Germany, but this regime, known as the Weimar Republic, was plagued by a lot of political and economic instability. Germany was particularly hard hit by the Great Depression because it had been a favorite target for, let me just move my screen over here so you can see the maps a little better. So Germany had been a favorite target for American investors during the 1920s, and because they had relied very heavily upon American loans to be able to make the reparation payments that they now owed to Britain and France, the government had begun to finance this deficit by printing more money. And this led to hyperinflation, as usually happens. In addition to all this economic difficulties, there's a lot of bitterness, as I mentioned, in the country after World War I. The Germans, many Germans felt like they had been betrayed during the war, that they hadn't really lost the war militarily, but they had instead been stabbed in the back by war profiteers and corrupt officials who were essentially traitors. And this belief was also linked with a growing nationalism and rampant anti-Semitism, so that anyone seen as not being truly German was suspected of having betrayed the country. The National Socialists, or the Nazis for short, capitalized on all of this bitterness and this economic instability to gain increasing amounts of political power in the late 1920s and early 1930s. Nazism is usually considered to be a particular type of fascism because it combines the very nationalistic, centrist, and militaristic aspects of a fascist state with a racial ideology. The Nazis believed that they claimed that they had a unique ideology, that this was something that was unique to Germany. And fundamental to the Nazi goal, according to Nazism, you simply couldn't have different cultures, different ethnicities within a single nation. Fundamental to the Nazi goal was the unification of all Germanic people. They believed that the Germanic people, or the Aryan, the master race, had been unjustly divided up into different nations. And Hitler claimed that people who couldn't defend their territory didn't deserve to keep it. So ethnicities or races that he thought of as being less worthy to exist than the Aryan master race were expendable, were disposable. And in particular, if the master race should require room to live, or Lebensraum, he thought that such a race should have the right to displace the inferior ethnic groups or racial groups. So in the early 1930s, the Nazis began to increase their presence within the German parliament. They began winning more seats in what was known as the Reichstag, the German legislature. Hitler is appointed as chancellor by President Hindenburg on January 30th, 1933. And just about a month later, the Reichstag building is set on fire under very suspicious circumstances. The Nazis blame this on communists, and they use it to suppress communist groups. After they're able to gain about 43 to 44% of the seats in the Reichstag, in the wake of this fire, they pushed through what was known as the Enabling Act. This essentially allowed Hitler and his cabinet to enact legislation without going through the German parliament, including changing the German constitution. After further suppression of opposition by banning or dissolving other political parties and assassinating opposition leaders, Hitler finally assumes real dictatorial power after President Hindenburg dies in 1934. The Nazis spent most of the mid 1930s rebuilding Germany's economic and military power. And although disturbing accounts and suspicious news is trickling out to the rest of the world, most people aren't really paying a lot of attention to what Germany was up to until Hitler begins to make his move to expand Germany's Lebensraum. In 1936, Germany moves to occupy the Rhineland. This is this strip here of territory between Germany and France. This is in violation of the Versailles Treaty, but Britain and France kind of looked the other way. They basically ignored it. This was a region that Germany and France have been fighting over for, years and years and years. 2 years later, in 1938, Germany annexes Austria down here in what was called the Anschluss. Again, other countries don't really do much other than just say, sort of, hey, maybe you shouldn't have done that. Germany is seen as retaking areas that are already heavily ethnically Germanic. Hitler also moves in that same year to occupy this area here, the orange area known as the Sudetenland. This is an ethnically German-dominated area of Czechoslovakia. Throughout all of this, the other nations of Europe are practicing what becomes known as appeasement, figuring that if they give Hitler what he wants, it's going to prevent conflict from erupting. Of course, now we look back at this policy of appeasement as a colossal mistake. It's widely ridiculed, widely reviled. It's viewed as one of the big mistakes of modern history. But at the time, we have to remember that Britain and France had gone through this devastating conflict of the First World War. A whole generation of young men had been completely wiped out in the First World War. And they are desperate. They are absolutely desperate to prevent war from happening again. So appeasement in that sense kind of makes sense for the British and the French, but of course it turns out to be a huge blunder. In 1939, the Soviet Union, which is not on this map here, but you can see this is where Poland is, and the Soviet Union is just to the right of that, signs a non-aggression pact with Hitler. And immediately thereafter, Germany invades Poland on September 1st, 1939. This is the final straw. This prompts Britain and France to finally say, wait a minute, this is too much, and they finally declare war against Germany. The Nazi Blitzkrieg, the Lightning War, quickly overran Poland and Scandinavia and Belgium and the Netherlands and France. And the British are basically left to fight Germany alone for about a year. They're trying to kind of hold off the German Blitzkrieg, and they're suffering very heavy casualties and bombing of major British cities. And even though the United States has a very close relationship with the British, many in the US are still very reluctant to get involved, to come to the aid of the British. There's a feeling like, sort of, oh no, here we go again. And many Americans are arguing that we should stay out of this. A group called the America First Committee is formed in September of 1940. And at its peak, the America First Committee has around 800,000 members, and it includes some pretty prominent Americans, pretty prominent people, politicians, business leaders, national celebrities like the aviation hero Charles Lindbergh, whom you can see speaking here at an America First rally. There are many reasons that people joined the America First Committee, but some of its leaders are Nazi sympathizers and were very supportive of anti-Semitism and white supremacy. The committee vocally argued against American involvement in the European War. So there is a very vocal contingent within the United States in the late 1930s and early 1940s that is arguing we should stay out of this. We should not get involved for a variety of reasons. One of which is that they are basically Nazi sympathizers, and they don't want us to get in the war against Hitler and Germany. FDR, he had been a member of Woodrow Wilson's administration during the First World War, and he was fairly heavily influenced by Wilson's ideas, particularly his ideas of internationalism, his idea that the United States needs to play a big role in the world, the idea that America can, sort of cultivate democracy abroad, that we can kind of create these international institutions that will prevent future conflicts from occurring. He also is pretty savvy, and he learns from Wilson's mistakes that had been made with the League of Nations. So he doesn't immediately call for the United States to jump in and get involved. He recognizes that there's still a lot of domestic opposition to getting involved. In December of 1940, FDR argues that the United States should be what he calls the great arsenal of democracy. And a few weeks later, in January 1941, he gave his State of the Union address, in which he laid out his beliefs, his ideas for which he believed America should be getting involved and should be kind of fighting on the side of the British and the French, who are trying to kind of oppose Nazi aggression. Added the phrase, everywhere. Roosevelt already had a vision for the post-war world before the United States even entered the war. And he articulated this vision in his 1941 State of the Union address, which is better remembered as the Four Freedoms speech. The speech was almost entirely devoted to this growing international conflict. And the last 4 minutes of his speech is where he outlines what he calls the four freedoms. He says the first is freedom of speech and expression everywhere in the world. The second is freedom of every person to worship God in his own way everywhere in the world. The third is freedom from want, which translated into world terms means economic understandings which will secure to every nation a healthy peacetime life for its inhabitants everywhere in the world. And the fourth is freedom from fear, which translated into world terms means a worldwide reduction of armaments to such a point and in such a thorough fashion that no nation will be in a position to commit an act of physical aggression against any neighbor anywhere in the world. So these are the four freedoms: freedom of speech, freedom of worship, freedom from want, and freedom from fear. And I like to show this copy of the speech that you can see on the screen here because you can see the edits that FDR has made to this speech. You can see that he's added in the phrase everywhere in the world to the last two freedoms. It's already typed into the first two, but he's added it in for the last two as well. And I think this phrase is very significant because here he's really making a pretty bold statement about the role that he thinks the United States needs to play in the post-war international situation. He is saying that these are the reasons why we are fighting and opposing, or we should be fighting and opposing militarism and fascism and aggression and authoritarianism, that we need to secure these freedoms, not just for Americans, right? He says everywhere in the world. And this is a pretty big role for the United States to play. He's saying that the United States is going to be the guarantor of these freedoms, not just for Americans, but for everyone, everywhere in the entire world. We are going to be the big power that is going to make sure that these four freedoms, freedom of speech, freedom of worship, freedom from want, freedom from fear, that everyone gets to enjoy those freedoms, not just a select few, not just for citizens of the United States, but for everyone. So this is pretty significant, and I think it's going to play a big role in the post-war world, as we're going to see. Now, pretty soon after FDR gives this speech, Congress passes the Lend-Lease Act in March of 1941. This was an agreement that lent the British military supplies that would be repaid later through British assistance and support in creating a new international economic order after the war was over. And over the course of the war, the United States contracts Lend-Lease agreements with over 30 countries. We lend other nations in the world who are fighting Germany and Japan and Italy around $50 billion in assistance. This is really the thing that ends up jump-starting the American economy and pulls the U.S. finally out of the Great Depression. Before the U.S. gets involved in the war officially, Roosevelt and Churchill begin planning for peacetime together. They meet together in secret under very heavy security in August of 1941 off the coast of Canada. And here they come up with a vision for the post-war world in what becomes known as the Atlantic Charter. Subsequently, a number of governments in Europe who are fighting against the Italians and the Germans adopt these principles. So what kind of world do FDR and Churchill want to see come out of the war? What are their priorities? The Atlantic Charter is kind of World War II's version of the 14 points. It contained many of the same principles. It said that the U.S. and the British are not fighting this war for any kind of territorial gain. It said that drawing up of any new national boundaries after the war had to be done on a democratic basis. It embraced the principle of self-determination, that every people should get to choose the form of government under which they live. It said things like free trade and freedom of the seas. It embraced the idea of disarmament. It also broadened the scope of the principles that had been laid out by Wilson in the 14 points to include things like improving labor standards, social security. I think it's interesting that this phrase, social security, which of course we've seen implemented in the United States, it appears in the Atlantic Charter, and economic advancement. And he also includes freedom from want and fear. Part of Roosevelt's four freedoms, the other two, of course, being freedom of speech and freedom of religion. So the Atlantic Charter, I think, is important, and it's going to become important when we think about how what happens during the Second World War is going to set us up for the conflict that comes afterwards. So how do we actually get involved officially in the war? Well, of course, on December 7th, 1941, Japanese planes attacked the U.S. naval base at Pearl Harbor in Hawaii. It was the first attack by a foreign power on American soil since the War of 1812. It was a devastating surprise attack. More than 2,000 American servicemen were killed, 187 aircraft, 18 ships, including 8 battleships, were destroyed or damaged. Why did the Japanese attack us? Well, there were a number of reasons, but one of the biggest things had to do with the economics. Remember, earlier in the year, FDR and Congress had passed the Lend-Lease Act, which authorized military aid for countries who were fighting what were known as the Axis powers, Germany, Italy, and Japan. The US began giving billions of dollars worth of arms to the British, who of course are fighting the Germans, but also to the Chinese, who are fighting the Japanese. We also end up giving assistance to the Soviet Union after Hitler renounces his non-aggression pact and invades the Soviet Union in 1941. We also end up freezing Japanese assets in the United States, which ends up stopping all trade between the US and Japan, including the sale of oil. Japan, of course, is an island nation. They need to import a lot of stuff from the United States. So this oil embargo is particularly problematic for them. One of the other reasons why Japan attacked had to do with their own sort of designs in the Pacific. Japan sees the United States as their big main rival imperial power in the islands of Asia. And Japan has designs to become kind of the conquering imperial power throughout much of Asia and the Pacific. And so they see the United States as being their big rival there. So in order to kind of execute their designs, they end up attacking Pearl Harbor, but they also end up attacking a lot of America's territories in the South Pacific, the Philippines, which of course, we are still occupying, Guam, other sort of islands in the South Pacific, which the United States holds as kind of territories or areas. At any rate, Japan attacks the United States, and this ends up sort of solving Roosevelt's dilemma of how to get America involved in World War II without risking alienating those who are still isolationist. After Pearl Harbor, basically everyone is in favor of fighting. So that's just a kind of very quick summary of the causes of the Second World War and why the United States ultimately gets involved. And next week, we are going to be looking at the question of what happens after the war. So keep some of the stuff that I've talked about today in mind when we start to cover the post-World War II era. All right, take care, everybody.